Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, state of the program for Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs. And look, there's no question about it. You look at some of the best programs across the country. Georgia's on the short list, if not the best program in the country heading into 2025. But, during the offseason, I think this is as good of a time as any to do a little bit of a check-in. And not only in terms of what we've seen on the football field, but that's where we'll start. When you're evaluating a head coach, when you're evaluating a college football program, wins and losses, that's where you want to start. Those matter. But let's check in terms of what the talent acquisition looks like. Let's look at what the player development looks like. Let's look at the coaching staff, which I think for a lot of Georgia fans is probably the hottest topic going into 2025. Hey, do we have that elite Georgia coaching staff that we're used to seeing under Kirby Smart? Because I think there are certainly some question marks you want to discuss when it comes to what the composition of coaching staff looks like for Georgia going into 2025 before we get into it. And as always, I would like to hear from the Georgia fans first, like an honest conversation, honest standpoint from the Georgia fans. Hey, how do we feel about where Georgia sits going into 2025? Appreciate you guys rocking with it. Georgia fans, y'all been showing the boys a lot of support for a very long time. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into this one. You got to start with on the field play over the last 4 years. You have two national championships. You have another SEC championship in the 2024 season. Look, many of y'all know I'm a Michigan fan. I'll come out and say it. In 2023, had there been a 12-team college football playoff, you ask a Michigan fan, who did you not want to see in the playoffs? It would have been the Georgia Bulldogs. You go back to 2023, that was national championship caliber. Now, in 2024, you saw a dip in play, and you saw a dip of play in a couple of different aspects within this Georgia program, right? Carson Beck was not the quarterback that I think a lot of us expected we were going to see in 2024. You saw arguably one of the worst pass catching groups that you saw in the SEC in 2024. The offensive line, in terms of that imposing run game, did not necessarily seem to be there either. You saw some things from Georgia in 2024 that, as a Georgia fan, look, 11-3 SEC championship, college football playoff berth. It's really hard to complain that much about it. But when the standard is national championship, there are some, I don't know if I'd use the word difficult, but there are some conversations you want to have in terms of, hey, how is this Georgia program running, operating, going into the 2025 season? I want to start with talent acquisition. One of the things that stands out, look, what Georgia does on the high school trail, there's really not a program that recruits the high school ranks more consistently and better than Georgia over the last couple of years. You see that consistently top three classes, if not the best class in the country. If there's two things that I look at and say I would like to see Georgia clean up in terms of overall talent acquisition, I think number one, impact players in the transfer portal. And you saw Georgia try to make some of those additions going into the 2024 year, but you look across the college football landscape and say some other programs made better, higher impact transfer portal additions, right? Caleb Downs at Ohio State, Quinshon Judkins, Seth McLaughlin, Will Howard. You look historically at Georgia and say they don't need to use the transfer portal all that much because of how well they recruit the high school ranks. But can you find that it doesn't have to be 5, 6, 7 players? For Georgia, it's probably only going to be 2 to 4. And say, hey, can we find 2 to 4 players that can be difference makers, game changers for us heading into the fall? And you look back at that 2024 class and say Georgia kind of missed on some of those evaluations, right? Benjamin Yasic, a guy that I thought was going to be very good for Georgia, kind of a non-factor. Trevor Etienne was certainly not the running back that we all expected coming into Georgia in 2024. Colby Young obviously had some off-the-field stuff. They kind of missed in terms of those marquee transfer portal additions. Can you get back on track with some of those additions in 2025? Because when you're playing, at least this is my opinion, you're competing for national championships. The margins are so slim. Like, just for example, what if Georgia had gotten one of the top wide receivers out of the transfer portal last cycle and just implement kind of stuck him on that Georgia team in 2024. How are we talking about Georgia in that 2024 year? Can you evaluate the transfer portal a little bit better? Is probably the one thing I would say. And then secondly, get back to stacking blue chip offensive linemen and doing kind of a little bit of research in terms of the roster composition of Georgia in the cycles of 2022 and 2023. Georgia only landed 4 blue chip offensive linemen between those two classes. You go back to the 2021 and 2022 cycles, they had 8. They doubled the blue chip offensive linemen. That's largely, at least in my opinion, I think a lot of Georgia fans probably share this sentiment. Why was Georgia so dominant in those national championship caliber or national championship years, you might say? They controlled the line of scrimmage on both sides of the football. If you want to do that, there's one way too, and that is recruit the high school ranks and develop those football players. Now, player development, we're going to get into that next. It's always been pretty damn good at Georgia. Can you get back to dominating the high school ranks on the offensive line? Because it felt like it took a little bit of a dip. Now, to Georgia's credit, in 2024 and in 2025, they got a lot of blue chippers coming through the pipeline. Can we get back to stacking that blue chip talent and dominating the line of scrimmage on Saturdays in the fall? If you can get back to that recipe, again, Georgia's not going anywhere as a college football program. Going to player development, it's always been elite at Georgia. It continues to be good. And if you're kind of nitpicking here, it really just has to do with a few different positions, right? Nobody develops better in the front seven. Linebackers, defensive line, they're going to continue to have some of the best front seven play that you see in the country. The one thing you're probably looking at here is we got to get these pass catchers ready. You know, in 2024, I'm a firm believer that kind of cost Georgia at a national championship shot. And I'm not saying Georgia would have won a national championship had they had better wide receiver play, but it kind of was the clear position that was holding them back. And that's not all that different from what we've talked about the last couple of years, right? When you had Brock Bowers, when you had Ladd McConkey, you saw Georgia win national championships and be some of the best college football teams that we saw in the last 10 years. Can you get back to developing that talent? Now, you got a lot of talent coming into this program, whether it's through the transfer portal, whether it's some of those true freshmen and Taylor and CJ Wiley. Can you get those difference makers on the outside really playing to their potential? Because you look at the projected NFL draft picks, it's a lot of guys on the line of scrimmage. It's a lot of guys in the front seven. What it's not are your pass catchers. You know, guys like Benjamin and Oscar Delp could have gone to the NFL draft, but I think it'd probably be even fair to say, yeah, Oscar Delp probably didn't have the impact that we all thought he was going to have in the 2024 year. That's the one area. Player development's not a problem for Georgia. It's kind of just in spots of their roster. Pass catchers needs to be better going into 2025. You got the talent to make it happen. Now you got to develop those players and put the puzzle pieces together going into 2025. Coaching staff, and this is probably the next interesting conversation, and that is, look, Kirby Smart. I mean, what do Kirby Smart and Nick Saban have in common? Like they've consistently put elite coaching staffs around them. Have the conversation about Mike Bobo, and I think my biggest, and I don't know if it's right to say a concern, but my biggest talking point here is when you're Kirby Smart in Georgia and you've had so much success over the last couple of years, do you maybe stop evaluating what your coaching staff looks like? Because it kind of happened with Dabo Sweeney, where I don't know if Kirby Smart's not a guy that gets complacent, so I don't think that's the right word to use. Maybe stubborn would be the right word, where it's like Dabo Sweeney was very content with his coaching staff that probably wasn't elite. And you saw Clemson take a slide over the last couple of years. I look at the coaching staff here. I look at Mike Bobo. You know, I look at a guy like James Coley coaching the wide receivers and say, is that elite? Is probably my question. I don't think they're horrible coaches, but are they elite? And we all know, following this Georgia program the last 5 years, the standard for the coaching staff is elite. Does Kirby Smart need to take a look at the staff and say, hey, maybe there are some spots where we can get a little bit better? I don't think that's unfair to say. 2025 will be that year. You know, if the offense does not find its groove again, you're probably going to see a change. You could argue the change probably should have happened after 2024. To wrap up this conversation, state of the program. It is still arguably the best program in the country, certainly top 3. How do you go about maintaining that? I think it's just continuing to look at it and say, hey, what are the small things that we need to tweak? There's not an overhaul that needs to happen with Georgia. Yes, it was a disappointing year in 2024. You do not have to overhaul the process in terms of how you operate, but there are probably some things that you want to take a look at. Transfer portal acquisitions, some staff on the offensive side of the football. Outside of that, in my opinion, Georgia's cruising, but we'll see in 2025. Georgia fans, let it fly in the comment section, specifically as we talk about transfer portal additions, as we talk about the offensive coaching staff, because I think there's probably a little bit of a need to change in those 2 departments. Would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.